So, in all earnest, it looks like Mark, you're the only one that I don't know fairly intimately. So hi, Mark. Uh, Everybody else knows me pretty well, but for for the presentation's benefit, I'll just give a little bit of a um, clarity on who I am. So, I currently am the director of codes and regulations here at Fenestration Canada. But before this, I managed the multifamily department at Innotech Windows and Doors. And before that, I created the multifamily installation department for Starline. Between those two companies, I spent a fair bit of time working through contracts and terms, the different methods both companies were using in order to kind of manage liability. I would say it was an interesting opportunity to both see how, like, Starline in the West Coast is a fairly large tower builder. And so, they would deal with things very differently than call it like Inotech at a smaller scale that in full earnest, what you wind up with is you get to bigger scales as you just use your legal hammer to smack people anytime that you don't like what they do. When you're smaller, you don't have that luxury that you can't just infinitely spend money to essentially scare people away. So this is going to be leaning a bit more towards what I would consider a small manufacturer practice could look like. So things that you can do to be a bit more thoughtful about your protections up front and just some of the checkpoints that I would put into play. Some of it is a bit administratively heavy that I think when you've got a small company, some of these tasks can be tough, but at least I'll try to build out a bit of a portfolio so that you guys can have some items that you can pick and pull from as you see fit. And I'll try to highlight the ones that I think are just absolutely critical. Um, so right up front, I've got a disclaimer. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer. This is all just based off of my experience and the conversations I've had with the various lawyers, but this does not constitute legal advice, and I will, you know, read the disclaimer and make sure you understand that it's like, please don't use this and then turn around and try to sue us for it. It would be a terrible idea. Um, so
Adrian, I just got you muted. I don't know if that's just me.
how about
Yeah, we
that?
can hear you.
Yep, that's
Oh,
better.
you're back.
Okay. So I'm going to start with some of the pre-contract topics. So these are the pieces that I like to be a bit more prepared for, even before I get the like letter of intent and the contract for me to negotiate. So, one of the big ones is ensuring the scope of the work is clearly defined. Yeah, this feels like it's kind of a silly thing, but actually it's really challenging, I find, in the sales process to define the scope well. So some of the things I would do is in my proposal documents, I personally have a preference on the template of like making sure all of my pricing, the things that my contractor really cared about, was right up front, and then underneath it was a whole series of, call it, guidelines and expectations. So that varied between setting timeline expectations, setting testing expectations, setting call it hardware and different things that might show up in the specifications that vary from what their specifications are. So I tried my best to ensure that the things that became common talking points were included in the latter end of my proposals. I would also do what our team was calling an architectural comparison. So I will take the windows that we're presenting and run them against the windows that the architect actually drew. Because so often I was essentially modifying what the architect's intent was in order for us to fulfill that bid. So I found that very important because oftentimes you find yourself in a later conversation. It's like, well, didn't you bid versus the spec, or didn't you bid versus the architectural? And if you don't provide those documents during the sales process, it can be really hard as you make kind of the transition from pre-construction to construction, um, and essentially hold your line. The contractor will push on that line if you have not been explicitly clear as you're defining your sales. But again, I can appreciate how difficult that is. I had certain things that I just didn't do at this stage because I knew there was no conversation about it. So, for instance, later on, I'll show you that one of the things I like to do is to add an appendix to the end of the contract that added my core terms to their contract. Trying to add that to the sales process, I would never recommend that. I've tried that a few times and it went very poorly. So, but that becomes one of those items that it's a bit of a negotiation. Uh, Relationship type matters a lot. So I had three that I was dealing with at any given time. Direct contact with the GC, direct contract with the GC. So those are ones where it is the general contractor and myself that have the agreement. I'll have contract manager agreement. So that means the general contractor is acting as a contract manager for the developer. So your relationship is actually with the developer, not with the general contractor. So the difference between those two is when you've got a direct contract with the general contractor, you know the person on the other side of that conversation is the one you're actually negotiating with. So anytime that I make changes, it is their liability they're putting on. When it's a contract manager agreement, you technically are in an agreement with the developer. So that means you not only have to work with the general contractor you're selling to, but you also now have to work with the developer that they're selling to. And so that becomes a much more difficult conversation. You kind of need to assess your risk about things like that. And then the last one, which I is my favorite, which is repeat customers. So ideally, you've already worked with this customer once before. And ideally, you've either had a direct contract with the GC or it's a contract manager agreement. Um, because what I oftentimes would do was take that previous agreement because we would have spent all the time to get all the terms just right. And then we would put it back on the plate and say, look, if you already agreed to this in the past, let's just agree to the same one again. And I had a couple really good general contractors that over time, what I did with them is we actually sat down before we were awarded projects or in between projects, and we would negotiate a core contract that we would continue to go back to. That was one of my favorite things to do with our general contractors is get to a place that it wasn't project specific, it was relationship specific. And so we would have those agreements that we'd always come back to, and it was a good balanced term agreement. Feel free, guys, at any time for you to raise your hand, and I'm happy to clarify points if there's stuff that shows up that you want a bit more information on. So, big piece for me about, any contract terms is balanced. Your job, because the contractor is going to give you things that are unbalanced, is to let them know that all of the terms that I intend to put forward is just to balance it so that, I'm not unfairly getting benefits and you're not unfairly getting benefits from this relationship. Because oftentimes, as you'll see as we go into like core contract terms, that's what's happening. That you are unfairly being asked to take on liability that has very little to do with your scope. So just as a thought process, that is kind of the core of what I'm always looking for is to fight for the contract to be balanced. All right, so paid when paid clauses. This is one of those that I would regularly cross out. So, an example of this is, payments will not be made more than 30 days after submission date or 10 days after certification or when we have been paid by the owner, which is whatever's later. This one shows up all the time in BC, shows up a bit in Ontario, and almost never showed up in my US contracts. Paid when paid was a bit less common in like Seattle and Portland. But in Canada, almost always, especially in BC. So the problem with this is that it puts like if you've got a direct if this is a contractor relationship, that means if they don't get paid by the developer for whatever reason, there's stuff that goes on in the background, the developer doesn't pay, you're left holding the bag for whatever like material you've already put into the project. You could essentially be playing bank to whatever general contractor is there, or whatever the developer and the general contractor are working through. I was not a fan, so I cross this out almost every time. It is challenging to fight sometimes because general contractors don't want to give up on this. But I strongly I found this particular clause to be really detrimental if I had left it in. Actually, before I go here, uh, yeah, before I get too far into contract terms, I do want to say one of the big things that I strongly advocate for is creating a process of contract review. So, for instance, if I were to do a direct to contractor relationship, what I would do first is I'd get my contract, I would go through and mark up all of the scope items that I felt needed to be changed. And then what I'd like to do is I would take all of the appendices that get added to the CC, DC, and CCA contract, and I send that to my lawyer and I have the lawyer go ahead and do all those markups first. I almost never looked at the appendices because there is so much back and forth on that particular item that I would have to do. You can do your markups and you can save yourself a little bit of money on the lawyer, but I found the amount of time that I was wasting on that particular item worth it to pay the lawyer, call it the extra $1,000 to review that particular portion. And so I would get the contract back at that point and I'd have notes from the lawyer, and then I would determine how much is reasonable, how much do I need to change, how much I should ask the lawyer to clarify. I was always really particular about not asking the lawyer for almost anything if at all humanly possible. Um, One thing I did with the lawyers that I thought was important was I would ask them to do risk categories. So I would ask them, give me green risk category when it's really a very small risk, something that we could accept, but you would recommend that we go ahead and change. Yellow, if it's something that it would be good for you to change, it is inappropriate, it is some risk. And then red, which is you absolutely can't accept this. This is unacceptable in a contract. So I did work with our lawyers to kind of get that language figured out. And I would recommend whoever you work with legally to do something similar because I found that it saved me a lot of time and it didn't really cost a lot more for them to do that.
Hmm. In order to save time, are you identifying sections that you were saying, like, hey, this is a section to look at, this is a section for the lawyer to kind of focus on?
Yeah, I typically would send the entirety of the contract, and then in the email thread, I would specifically call out, like,
Hmm.
hey, please look at this section when you're reviewing it. Because what I found is the lawyer oftentimes, when they're reviewing the contract, will have certain supplement documents that they do want access to so they can validate. So I would include the entirety of the contract, but I would call out specific sections. I only want you to look at this because I don't want them looking at scope because they frankly won't know enough about our scope to be valuable on that front. You really, in my opinion, should be responsible for reviewing scope and writing up whatever you need as far as scope requirements go. But all right, so consequential damages. Consequential damages, special damages, liquidated damages. I would say of all the clauses that I will give you, if this one shows up, that deserves a big red X every time, non-negotiable. Consequential damages is a place where if at any time the subcontractor decides that there is negligence or that you have violated your contract, or especially if they do this in combination with in the opinion of, it's just a place where you can take money and throw it down and light a match and burn it. Um, these kind of damages are just it is it's an awful place to find yourself in because you really could just be held liable for anything that goes wrong and anything that's being delayed, and it's a place where contractors can essentially make up whatever money they think they can get out of you. So big fan, please X those whenever humanly possible. um, in the opinion of is another one that I'm not a fan of. It becomes very much a interpretation of the contractor on what they think should be done or should have been done or should have been agreed to. Um, whenever humanly possible, what I will do is when I see in the opinion of, I will try to create a concrete example, or I will take the subjective out of that conversation. I always try to leave it as objective as humanly possible on that language. So that can take a little bit of working, but I think it's well worth it because you don't want to be essentially up to the contractor's opinion of what's going on in the situation. Because when things get bad, the contractor is going to just beat you and say it was your fault every time. At least that was my experience. I did have a couple contractors that I think were pretty thoughtful with when they use their hammer, but all contractors will eventually use a hammer. Indemnification, hold harmless. This is another one of those that is very similar to, I mean, it's not the same money liability problem, but it's very much along the same lines of you could find yourself holding the bag for a series of issues that have nothing to do with you. So, anytime you see indemnification or hold harmless clauses, this is another one you can put a big red X on that you agreeing to defend and indemnify and hold harmless anything that happens that may result from the work that you did is way too much interpretation for my liking. Another one that I think is really interesting is the Homeowners Protection Act in BC, the subcon like your warranty to the client. I got this a lot where I had contractors that were coming to me and saying, I need you to essentially uphold the Homeowners Protection Act and the warranty there within. That is not your responsibility. You are, as a subcontractor, responsible for a very narrow portion of the build. The Homeowners Protection Act is designed for general contractors to homeowners. So, for you to agree to the same warranty requirements as the Homeowners Protection Act that the general contractor is, essentially is you saying, I own the totality of the potential risk of the building. That's insane. I oftentimes found myself having to do some serious rewording of whatever they had forward for their Homeowners Protection Act. And I would whenever humanly possible add um, the subcontractor's warranty or the seller's warranty. I always provided the warranty as part of my attached documents. That was a huge thing for me, so that I always had it as reference. If possible, I would try to include the warranty as a contract document in the actual contract. But yeah, this is another one of those that feels like it's snuck through over and over again, and it is something that I think you've got every right to negotiate back on. Hold back beyond 10% outlined by the CCA or CCDC contract. So on supply only contracts, there is no holdback requirement. For most glaziers, that's not going to be an issue, right? You're not going to do a lot of supply only contracts. But for supply and install, you have a 10% requirement via the CCA or CCDC contract. I saw it surprisingly often that they would add additional percent to hold back for a whole variety of things. Um, that's not reasonable in my view, that you are already holding the bag for 10% of whatever that contract value is. I think that's a fair place that you can push back on. Um, I didn't say it at the beginning, but I do have an unfair bias that I find the appendices that are added to the CCA and CCDC contracts unacceptable. Like, we have standard contracts for a reason. The fact that we're having to negotiate these things for 40 additional pages is absolutely insane. But so this is a bias I have. It's like, really, I would like for the world to be kept to these standard contracts, but that's not the world you live in. All of
What,
these things become really necessary.
what's the holdback for and how does it work?
Yeah. So the holdback is essentially, and this is a bit of a difficult explanation. The holdback is whenever you have completed your contract or completed the work for your contract, the contractor gets to hold an additional 10% until substantial completion. So that's actually a really good point. It's important for you to be clear about what substantial completion means within your own personal contract, because I can't tell you how often I found the contractors held me accountable for their substantial completion, not mine. So my substantial completion should be essentially I have billed for up to 90% of my total contract value. and I have provided all of the necessary engineering and closeout documents for the project.
So Adrian,
That
in Ontario, I know that particular point, doesn't matter who you are or what you are, the 10% won't get paid until it hits commercial news as it's been released.
I wholly agree. The only way that I've managed to get through that is building sign-offs. So what we had was a process that we had a QC list that once the windows were all installed, I had my team do an internal QC list where we would sign off on all of the different components so that it was, call it move-in ready. Then we had the general contractor. We requested the general contractor also come through with us and do a sign off of the building. They almost never did that. So what I would do instead is I would send an email to the general contractor expressing that we have completed the work. We requested for you to do the walkthrough, but you have not confirmed a time or place. We will consider the walkthrough complete. And if they don't respond within 3 days, it's called tacit approval. So then I would turn around and say, look, you have approved that my scope is complete. I've provided you all the closeout documents, which means that I have every right to request holdback. Ideally, at that point, you've provided enough evidence that they do it. I've had it happen twice where they did, but it is a hard one. I will say oftentimes the contractor really likes to put their feet down and say absolutely not. But at that point, you have legal, you have legal recourse to essentially request that, and you can. But then you get into lien act, and it's never worth that. So your best hope is you provide the evidence, and they just try to help. But anyway, yeah, you're totally right, Jeff. This is one of those areas where it's almost impossible to fight, but I would not accept more than 10% is my point about this particular item.
10's the maximum, man. Don't ever go more.
Don't ever go more.
And always pre-bill huge in the beginning, so you're way out in front with money.
There's a whole segment about that.
Yeah.
So prime contract is another one of those that I personally find really frustrating. And so the prime contract is oftentimes the contract with the general contractor to the developer. It can show up actually more often when you have an agreement with the developer that they will reference the prime contract they have with their contract manager, which is really frustrating. So the problem with the prime contract is you wind up having to get that second agreement and then baseline that against the agreement that you're having to sign. So that means you're really referencing both the CCA and the CCDC contract with all the appendices and the scope, and the prime contract and any terms that may conflict. So if that happens, and they have absolutely said they will not cut the prime contract out, that is when the lawyer becomes absolutely essential, because I won't go through that exercise. It is mind numbing, and I sucked at it, frankly. Like I could never quite get all, to both contracts to quite line up. So I think if you have to do it, the lawyer is really important. But what I would tell the contractor to try to convince them to remove any relationship to it is the amount of time they're going to waste with you, because you're going to use a lawyer to go through that process, and it's going to be arduous for both of you. Almost always the general contractor will remove terms about prime contract at that point. They won't maintain it, or they'll be good to include elements of the prime contract they really care about in the contract directly. So that is your best case scenario, is essentially convince them that the prime contract is going to be a giant headache for all involved. So testing requirements is an item that I was talking with Brent a little bit about. This is a really good one because I feel like it's something that actually touches multiple documents throughout the process in order to do it correctly. So oftentimes I found testing requirements to be hidden within specifications, and sometimes very poorly articulated within testing or within the specifications. So what I would do is a few things. First, I would ensure that testing requirements and testing expectations were outlined in my proposal. That like we explain a bit of what we would expect as far as testing. So what are the pressures? How many tests are we agreeing to? And then once we get into the agreement, I try my best to make sure that's articulated again. So if it's not in the contract, try to add a section that clearly articulates, like how many times we're testing, what the test pressures are. And then finally, I added my shop drawings that I had a section that was specific to, what the test pressures were. So testing is a big thing, and I think it's so easily missed. And if it's not in multiple documents through the process, you will find yourself doing whatever the envelope consultant says, which I don't know how many people here have had that experience, but I personally find it so frustrating to have an envelope consultant say you have to test based off of your lab test pressure.
Yep.
Not how things work. Like you test to 2/3 at maximum is kind of the industry standard, and trying to get them to believe that when they are so hell-bent on the idea that it's going to be laboratory tested. This is a great piece to just be thoughtful of as you go through the contract process, that you really needed it in multiple documents.
Adrian, before you go on, can you just talk about some of the strategies you have in communicating these? I mean, besides like, if you don't take this change, I'm walking from the deal. I mean, what are some ways that you would negotiate or try and get them to kind of adjust to your position?
Yeah, so I will be honest, what I found when you get to this point where you're talking about the different terms in your contract, you already have a contract with them. Like meaning they've already have a letter of intent with you. Like they would have to pull off of essentially selecting you as a manufacturer for each job. You don't want to become so irritating that they feel the need to. But the truth is, they're willing to put a lot of effort into this contract process, because selecting another manufacturer to do that job is really irritating. It is a lot to undo on their side to essentially pull you from their bank requirements. Like that becomes the truth, is you are so tied into the job by the time you have the contract that you have every right to sit here and ensure that it's balanced. That's actually worth a note. I have gotten contract requirements before, like meaning somebody gave me the contract before I agreed to the bid. What I would tell people is, I can, but I'm going to charge you ahead of time for the lawyer fee, so that if I do not get this contract, then I haven't wasted money on this, because it will cost me time and my lawyer time to review this. So I would say be careful about signing anything that creates an agreement to future contract terms before you get the letter of intent. And don't be afraid to negotiate for these terms once you have it. That's my easiest thing is, it's okay for you to negotiate once you have it, but it's going to take time. Like if you want to be protected, you need to be patient with it. Like if they're telling you, oh, I need the letter of intent back in 3 days, or I need the contract back in 3 days, you can tell them, absolutely not. My lawyer is going to take about 2 weeks in the process. My team will take about a week to 2 weeks to review the language and ensure that the comments back are appropriate. I usually just slow down the process, because again, they may put time pressure on you as far as getting this stuff back, but they're committed once they've given you the letter of intent. It's really hard for them to back out. Don't be afraid to push back is going to be my final say on that. Okay, so common scope items that show up. So field dimensions versus guaranteed dimensions. This one's an interesting one for me, because I would say in the commercial world, you wind up doing more layouts than I ever did on punched openings. So there's a bit more justification on getting field dimensions. I don't think timelines make any sense for field dimensions, frankly. And I am a big fan of essentially saying, once the architectural has come out and the design has been decided, the shop drawings are going to govern whatever that work is. I'll go as far as including our shop drawings, engineered shop drawings, as part of the contract documents, so that essentially that governs what should be on site. That is a huge pressure relief on the whole idea that your responsibility is to take field dimensions for the whole thing. On window wall and punched openings and storefront, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Curtain wall really is a different deal. So the members here are going to have a better feel for what is appropriate in those kind of situations. But I would say for the rest, it's very appropriate for you to essentially push back and say guaranteed dimensions are industry standard. I find in all the areas in the US and all the areas in Canada that I've worked and done multifamily, mid-rise, high-rise, low-rise projects, no problem. I've never gotten significant pushback on that. I make it a point anytime that something shows up in my scope that is outside of my scope, that it is marked out. Do not just say, because I've gotten contractors that come back and say, well, this is just a general template. It covers everything. Don't worry about it. I am not a fan of that logic. I am a big fan that you go through, if you like, for instance, hot roofing or framing that shows up in the contract. I'm a big fan, just cross out everything not related. You really don't want your contract to be related to anybody else's scope. It becomes a really easy place for the contractor later to say, well, but it's in your contract, or it's in your scope in your contract. So don't just accept the general bullet point template argument. I think that's a bad one.
Yeah, Adrian, excuse me. There's a good one there for that EEG one. Is I've noticed in bigger jobs like that are commercial curtain wall, they slip in the NCSO requirement. You have to have an NCSO on staff, and if you don't catch that, you really get screwed over, man. Let me tell you.
Permits for the building. I almost always knock off any flaggers. That's a big one. It's like we've got no business getting into the whole management of your site and paying for that. This is one of those areas where so often the contractor is trying to shove in a whole bunch of like add-ons to your contract so they can remove it from theirs. So it's really important that you don't accept the boilerplate argument, that you need to go through and mark off everything that you do not agree to.
Yeah.
Approved and sealed shop drawings. There's oftentimes language on this one, and I would say make it as clear as humanly possible. I've seen all kinds of ways that it's worded that just doesn't make sense, but I like to make sure shop drawing, like engineered approved shop drawings, are a huge portion of kind of the scope items and how we detail that. Again, what I do with that particular item is that I had a additional document we added to the end that gave actually timelines on when to expect the shop drawings and what the different steps of the shop drawings would look like, so that it was clear, because it's such a long process. Like for me, it was one of the longest processes for getting any of these jobs done. Define timeline of execution. Again, kind of same idea. I think if that's not explicitly in the scope, then it needs to be added to it, is what the timeline expectation should be. Again, this is another one of those items I added to the proposal document so that the timeline there would line up with the timeline on the contract. I don't really think I've got anything to say about Schedule B and C, other than it's our responsibility to make sure that it's there at the end of the project. Escalation. So escalation is definitely one of those items that I think are tricky, because the contractor really does not want to agree to escalation, and you really need to have it. So especially on high-rise projects where you're going to have 2 years out from your execution of whatever they've given you. Again, this is one of those that I added to my appendix. Escalation was 6 months. So once you agreed to the contract, what I told them was that we had a year to execute on that contract. If we did not execute on that contract within a year, we add 3% of the total cost of the project. If it does not execute within the next 6 months of that year, then it's another 3%, and every 6 months it would be that. I have had to negotiate that particular, call it term set, multiple times, where instead of a year, they ask for 18 months, or instead of a year, we create some other agreement. But the point of ensuring escalation is that you cannot possibly hold on to your, call it, product costs for more than a year. Who is going to guarantee your glass and your hardware and all of your frame is going to keep the same price for a full year? So, I mean, the only thing you could do outside of that is to buy the material and store it early, all of it. And so I've actually had contracts where instead of escalation, what they agreed to was that they would put up a warehouse and we would buy the material and store it in their warehouse. And then we have a bit of like a transportation cost conversation instead. And that was for a project that was like a 3-year project, meaning that it was going to execute in 3 years, and it was like a 2-year length of a project. So anyway, that beats the crap out of escalation. But as-built drawings, is an interesting one, because the engineering trades no longer view any of the drawings that show up at the end of the project as built. That term doesn't actually exist in, call it, the engineering field anymore. I personally like to keep my drawings as clean as possible, because there's always change orders that come along throughout the project that will change certain things. So for my own record keeping, I was a big fan of keeping those things as clean as possible. But truly, once you've got an engineered set of drawings, that is what the field would consider an as-built drawing. But that's a little bit of you and your engineer to decide what your comfort level is. Because if major things have changed and it's going to impact structural elements or impact anything that in their calculations they need to be considerate of, they may ask you to go ahead and go through and make those changes. And I would say, again, my own best practice was to make sure that those changes were incorporated in the drawings whenever humanly possible. And then I provided whatever that final drawing was at the end of the project with my closeout documents. But anybody that calls it as built is incorrect. That is not how that works anymore. Envelope expertise. This was one of those I had a tendency to, or any third-party contractor responsibilities. This kind of goes on the whole out of scope conversation, but oftentimes I found the contract was asking me to become the envelope expert. So we were responsible for dealing with water mitigation for the project, or we were responsible for overseeing the energy consultant, or any number of third-party contractor responsibilities that I think it's really important for you as a supplier and installer to not agree to. If you have a third-party engineer for that project that is going to be covering those categories, it is critical you don't agree to it, because you're essentially going to be rubbing up against somebody who you don't want to take on that liability on their sphere. Quantity. Oh yeah. So quantity of openings before work. I had a tendency to ensure it was built into both my contract terms, my proposal terms, on a minimum of like 50 openings needed to be ready before I would start the work. Because the last thing you want is to find yourself in this piecemeal deal where you're doing like 3 or 4 windows at a time in order to keep the schedule for the general contractor as clean as humanly possible. And what they really wind up creating is, whenever you've got, call it 3 to 5 windows that you're doing at any one time, you wind up just on top of other trades, and it becomes a complete waste for you, complete waste for the general contractor. So setting that expectation early that you need a certain amount of runway before you start doing the work, I think is absolutely critical. On high-rise work, I didn't feel like that was as bad, because you were expected to do a floor a week, and then it was very routine. But I dealt with this whole quantity of openings piece a lot. And so, to a side note on that, it is really hard, in my opinion, to beat out a contract or a change order for delays based off of, these openings weren't ready and these openings weren't ready, and now I'm coming back multiple times in my install. What I did in order to deal with called the delay clauses that may show up in the future is I would ensure that my contracts clearly called out how many times I'm going to go to site and install. I forgot, I'm spacing on the word at the moment, but my like the amount of times that I show up to site needs to be a fixed number. And if I go beyond that fixed number, then I can go back to the contractor and say, hey, you've spent more of call it my time showing up than we've allotted to in the contract. What I would do in those circumstances, I would tell them, like, you've already done this. This would be the cost if I was going to charge you, but I will provide this as a goodwill. Please remember this as we hit other obstacles that might be more complicated. So I would try to use those as gimmies whenever possible, because you're almost never going to get them to pay you a change order for a delay of your work. Hoisting. It totally depends on the type of windows you're installing, but I got out of hoisting whenever humanly possible. Like, if I didn't have to have at height equipment or have to deal with hoisting, I avoided it like the plague. I had one project where we missed that and wound up paying for a hydro lift. So for anybody that's rented a hydro lift, that's not cheap. So I would be really explicit on what your requirements for hoisting are, and if you can, stay out of it. Because you really don't, like, if you've got a boom lift on site, that's one thing. But even that, like, coordinating a boom lift and how you're going to deal with your elevations can be just a giant headache. And on a high rise, you shouldn't have that problem. The building's already going to have a lot of the hoisting requirements built into the general contractor scope, or into the cider scope, or into somebody else's. I think on the Windows side, you mostly can get out of hoisting. You just have to be creative with who the other parties are that are responsible for that.
Yeah, another way for that is to coordinate or ask for time on crane. So say these are the number of days I need, this is set times I need, might be after hours or before hours, and just state that in your contract that you have to have availability of the crane.
Absolutely. I'm 100% in agreement with that. All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think defining a process for your contract review is one of the best protections you can set up, is just have a process that you can clearly articulate to the general contractor on what's going to happen in the backside. Again, for me, I was a big fan of letting the lawyer do the lawyer's work when it comes to any of the appendices to the CCA or CCDC contracts. Any just boilerplate legal language that doesn't come across as human language, just let the lawyer deal with those. I wouldn't personally get into that, because it requires you to know enough precedent that you're unlikely to do it justice. So if you don't have a good lawyer, make sure you've got a good lawyer. All terms are negotiable. Like, be anything that you guys don't like on the contracts, know that they are negotiable. You can negotiate anything on the contract. It's just certain things will be harder to change than others. And that's where I think having the lawyer kind of put that green, yellow, red solution becomes really helpful. It's like you can decide how important it is to how important it is to you. But again, for me, the best thing you can do is just be clear with the general contractor that you are working as a partner with them. And the best way you can do that is to ensure the terms are balanced. This isn't just about protecting you, and it's not just about protecting them. Ideally, the contract is essentially irrelevant to the conversation. Like, if you've done your job really well, this whole contract negotiation thing becomes irrelevant to how you deal with things on site. The contract should be something that you should be able to say, like, hey, I never needed it in the process, because when problems showed up, the general contractor and I worked together and we made it happen. So if you can be clear that that is your goal in this whole thing, is like, we just want to get balanced terms so that we're all on the same page, but ideally we never have to refer to this. That's best case scenario, in my opinion. Again, adding contract documents, big fan. It is not an easy thing to do, but it is well worth it if you can clearly define what your requirements as a contractor or as a seller for that project. Um, so I tried to do this as much as I could in this presentation, and I didn't do it as well as I would have wanted to. One suggestion we got from the lawyer that I thought was really interesting was whenever humanly possible, redefine subcontractor to seller. So a seller has significantly more rights than a subcontractor does. And so when you change that, it actually, if you ever found yourself in a legal process, you actually will have an easier time of defending your positions as a seller than you do a subcontractor. And last and not least is payment terms. So for me, we have our cultural standard in BC of doing, you don't get paid as a seller until you've delivered product to site, and then you've got your 10% holdback on install, those kind of pieces. What I think is really interesting is I worked in Quebec for a project, and they had completely different rules. Like they were used to essentially the 50% deposit, and then they would work through, call it the payment terms. So you would be paying, you would get a 50% deposit, and then you would have terms on like I deliver the product, I get paid for that product with like a schedule of value type of thing. Um, I think it is an open negotiation truly on payment terms, and it's worth a discussion on what is reasonable both for your company and reasonable for the general contractor. I know Mike Bruno and I had a good conversation about this at the last Windor on how they deal with some of their multifamily work, and it's very much a get a deposit. Like they firmly believe in getting deposits up front so you can pay for your materials. Sometimes I would negotiate with the contractors to have them pay me for shop drawings, for legal, for administrative pieces that are happening in the background, that I would include that as part of my schedule of values when I get the contract, and then I would create expectations of when we would pay that out. So I think I say all of this to you are not set to a culture of payment terms. That is negotiable. Like you should make sure you align what your company's needs are with what the contractor is willing to do on that front. It's, in my opinion, easier to just follow kind of cultural norm in BC and ship product and get paid per the schedule of values. But if that doesn't work for you, know that you have that. You really should have that flexibility. And because you're into the contract negotiation portion of the conversation, you don't have to agree to the payment terms they put forward. You can still negotiate that. So. All right. So that kind of brings me to the end of the outline that I've put together. And so any questions, anything that we could talk a little bit more about that might be helpful?
Well, I mean, I thought it was fantastic. I'll just jump in here. Thanks, Adrian. But one comment is a lot of the people in the commercial industry are on the smaller side of it. And so I think both, your product becomes more generic, so maybe you have less differentiating factor, and then maybe, you don't have as big of a hammer. Any suggestions in terms of like as those smaller jobs and smaller players to try and navigate that effectively?
Ooh, sales process or contract process?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it impacts both. Yeah, maybe, in related to contract.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned in the contract process, I mean, first off, I always included for call it those legal fees in my costs. I was always a mindful piece is that I had it built into a spreadsheet that I was calling out legal as a cost that I was going to have to spend on the project. I think for smaller contractors, again, there is a little bit of understanding you're unlikely to get kicked off that job if you're going to push back on the contract at this point. Like if you're the commercial glazer on that project, the difficulty in a general contractor pulling you from it is fairly substantial. Now that being said, again, they can. So I do think having a letter of intent from the general contractor and then marking that up and having it signed so that you're already legally binding to the project before you start getting into like full on contract negotiation is really important. And maybe that's a note to make. The letter of intent, I almost always attached my proposal and any of the relevant contract documents I wanted to see in the future. So I would take I would take that letter of intent and I would make sure that I've got as much of my scope that I agreed to via the proposal and like our negotiations with general contractor as I can, or as I could get away with. Um, and again, maybe this additional attachment that I'm talking about may be harder for smaller contractors because you just don't have the same weight in the conversation. Like that may not be something you can get them to agree to. But contract terms in the agreement, yeah, unless they're giving you a real strong indication that they're going to kick you off the job for not agreeing to the right terms, I think it's okay for smaller contractors to feel a bit emboldened to say, look, I'm doing this for protection of my company. Like I can't afford a small company to agree to liquidated damages or consequential damages. That's totally unacceptable. You will crush my entire company in one fell swoop. So I think it's important, especially for smaller contractors, to be able to put their hand up on certain clauses that could wreck their company and say, I can't agree to this contract unless you guys change this so that it works. So it's figuring out where your liability lines are and figuring out a process that makes it both not so cumbersome. I think is the real difficulty I see because I can't tell you how many times I had contracts that we would get the contract at the beginning of the project, and I'd be signing the final contract as we were essentially leaving site. Like we wouldn't have a completed contract until at the end of the project. I had projects that we never even signed the contract by the end of it. We essentially had a tacit approval for the contract, which apparently, according to the lawyer that we had, was perfectly acceptable. That if we signed it and they didn't sign it on their side, then it is a tacit approval until they come back and they have some discussion about it. Because the contract can still be negotiated if it hasn't been signed by them. But yeah, anyway, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
I got a quick one. So I don't use contracts, luckily, in my role a lot, thankfully. But just out of curiosity, and this is a newbie question. If you strike out a clause on a contract, sign it and send it back, and they sign it, is that legal?
That's legally binding. Correct. Yeah. So that oftentimes is what the contracts look like for me at the end of it. Is that I've got a whole bunch of markouts with my initials and then if they sign the contract and I've signed the contract, that's legally binding.
But usually you want their counter initial beside yours at each of those points. Otherwise, it's not binding.
It is if they've signed the bottom line of the agreement. Right. But ideally, what you've got is them signing off each page, right?
Yeah. Right. Good to know. Excellent, by the way, Adrian. That was awesome. I learned a ton, and yeah, really good information. Scary. I feel for everybody that needs to sign everything away.
I think it is a really valuable conversation. So anyway, we'll post it online and hopefully get some more circulation. I thought it was fantastic. Thanks, Adrian, for your time.